Good afternoon. I'm Michael Freeman. I am speaking to you from Oregon on the west coast of the United States. And I'm sorry not to be with you there in person, but I know that everybody probably is doing the same thing I'm doing, which is mostly staying home right now. Maybe next year we'll be able to get together and see each other in Utrecht or some other beautiful location like that. I'm going to be talking today about causation in auto litigation. This is an area that chiropractors sometimes get pulled into, but it's also an area where there's not a great deal of systematic practice. In other words, everybody kind of does their own thing to a certain extent. So I'm going to talk to you about the more structured ways of evaluating causation, which allow you to be able to talk about cause and effect relationships, and particularly in medical legal settings, and be able to demonstrate that there is a reliable method that is being applied. Causation is important in all types of litigation, criminal and civil, and this is because all cases have to have some evidence that a harm occurred, whether it's an injury or an illness or a death, and all cases have to have some evidence that there was something that could have caused it, some sort of negligent action or a wrongful action being criminal, an assault, for example, whereas a negligent action would be something that wasn't criminal, like failing to use a car correctly, failing to obey a traffic signal, and causing a crash. But the thing that has to link those two together, the wrongful action and the observed injury, the diagnosed injury, is causation, a causal link. And that's something that is sort of a different realm of evidence. Cause and effect relationship is difficult to explain. When we talk about cause and effect, we talk about the thing that follows the other, without which it would not have occurred. It's kind of an explanation for it. But we tend to know a cause when we see it. As an example, I've got a little animation here on this slide where I've got a red ball hitting a blue ball. And if I asked you whether the blue ball was caused to move by the red ball, you'd probably say yes, most of the time anyway. So if we change the circumstances a little bit, for example, the red ball strikes the blue ball but it doesn't move quite as quickly, we might say, well, I'm not sure about that one. And if I give you a different circumstance where the red ball seems to come to a stop and the blue ball takes off, those two things seem to be independent. So we recognize a cause, and a lot of the time we recognize a cause because of a temporal relationship. The timing's really close, and it doesn't seem like these two things were coincidental. But actually, in none of those animations did the blue ball cause the red ball, the red ball cause the blue ball to move, because they're just animated circular images that I got off the internet, and I just animated them to look like they were moving. So the actual cause is me. In this particular experiment, if you will, I get to be God. But in real circumstances, car crashes, injuries that occur afterwards, we're dealing with people's lives, people's health, and we're also dealing with an area where nobody's there to explain, oh yeah, I'm the one who did that, I made that happen. So everything is very inferential. This is because causation is not an observable phenomenon. And that is something that a lot of people have trouble with. We tend to think in a legal setting, judges tend to think this way, that a causation is the same thing as a diagnosis. You can see a cause because you can see a diagnosis. And that's completely false. You can see a diagnosis because everybody can look at the same x-ray and agree that the same bone is fractured. That's a diagnosis. But what caused the bone to break, that is something you can't see. I'll give you an example. Everybody can look, a 5-year-old can look at these two x-rays and tell you the one on the left is abnormal, that leg is broken, and the one on the right is not. The diagnosis is easy to agree on because it's based on evidence we can all see. and nobody can really deny. But if I told you that the person who got the broken leg was in an intersection car crash, and they were hit by two different cars and they lost consciousness, so they don't know which car crash caused the injury. So let's say we have first the frontal crash here on the left, and then we have the side crash on the right. And I said, which crash caused it? You can't tell that by looking at the x-ray. You can't tell that by looking at the cars. But if I told you that the risk of the injury, the chance that the injury would occur, is 10 times greater in the car crash on the left than the car crash on the right, you might be tempted to say, it's 10 times more likely it's the car crash on the left. I don't know for sure, but that's what's likely. Now, where does risk come from? Well, risk is a metric for what occurs in populations, and it's based on things that have happened before. For example, if we look at these two fine gentlemen, one guy is obviously much less likely to have a heart attack tomorrow than the other guy. We know that not because the guy on the right is having a heart attack. We know that because the guy on the right has characteristics that studies of other people previously have told us make you more likely to have a heart attack. Obesity, inactivity, type 2 diabetes, whatever. And that information comes from epidemiologic study. Epidemiologic study, study of populations. I mean, obviously this is an important topic in the present time. We're all trying to talk about things like the frequency of COVID infection, the kind of risk factors that lead to higher chances of COVID infection, and the things that are preventing those kind of infections. That's very much in the news, obviously. And the exact same principles are applied to understand people getting hurt in car crashes. So for this reason, concepts from epidemiology, and definitely risk data from epidemiology, actually makes its way into causation opinions. The difficulty here is that if you're talking about epidemiologic study, it doesn't really relate to individual causation. That is something that is done by clinicians. This is the kind of work that chiropractic physicians do, is they're asked to determine whether or not somebody's current condition was caused by a crash or something else. But if epidemiology is needed, and epidemiology for an assessment of causation, and epidemiologic study is where risk comes from, then how do we close that gap between individual causation and the information needed to assess individual causation? We don't really have any kind of training that we can point to that everybody does the same way. It's not like differential diagnosis, for example. So medicine, chiropractic, there's this concept of specific causation of the individual. It's not very well standardized. I mean, it's not something that you can point to and say, here's the book that we all followed. Not very far from here, here, Utrecht, which is where I thought I was going to be. About 2 hours away by train ride is Maastricht. And in Maastricht is where I teach a program about this concept, forensic epidemiology, how epidemiology is used to evaluate cause and effect relationships. And I have 5 PhD students currently, and a 6th one coming on, and 2 of those, including the 6th, happen to be chiropractic physicians. So their medical training, if you will, comes from their chiropractic, and now they're being trained in how to apply epidemiologic information to forensic medical questions like causality. So how do we get from population-based risk to individual causation? You don't really think about that very often until you think about, for example, vaccination. So if a child is not vaccinated and the child gets sick from the thing he would normally be vaccinated against, can we say that the failure to vaccinate caused his illness? Well, we probably can. If we say that 99% of illness is eliminated by vaccination, then we can say that 99% of the cause of this child's illness would have been eliminated if he had been vaccinated. What we use to measure individual causation is called attributable risk. The example I just gave you is a good example of attributable risk. The child who doesn't get vaccinated with a vaccine that eliminates 99% of disease and who gets sick, in that child we could say 99% of the cause of his illness is the failure to vaccinate him. Here's an example just of how attributable risk is used. Think about smoking and cancer in the population. About 20% of people who smoke in a lifetime will get lung cancer. About 1% of people who don't smoke or less will get lung cancer. So if we put those two values together and we look at just the people who smoke and get lung cancer, if we have a person who smoked and got lung cancer, we could say 95% of his risk, or 19 out of 20% of the total risk, is due to the smoking. And that 5%, or 1% of the total, of 20%, which is 5% of 100%, would be attributable to him if he had not smoked. So 19 out of 20 of the cause of the lung cancer would be eliminated if the smoking goes away. In the U.S. and starting to spread into other countries, the concept of using epidemiology as a basis for causal determinations, or at least a support for causal analysis, has made its way into case law. In 2016, this was kind of a big deal in the U.S. because one of the current Supreme Court justices was on the U.S. Court of Appeals and was on a panel that decided that there was a generally accepted method for assessing causation from traffic crashes, an injury causation method. The case described a three-step process of injury causation and said that it was the generally accepted method used for assessing causation. And that was a case called Etherton, and described how the doctor who was there testified that there was a method that he used that was published in the peer-reviewed biomedical literature that started with the first step, which was called general causation, just whether or not the injury can result from the particular event. In this case, it was a crash. The second step was to look at timing, temporal relationship, and the third step was to look and see whether there were alternative causes that could be ruled out, and such that it could be stated that the particular crash caused the particular injury that was observed or diagnosed. The cited paper was a paper that I published in 2009. So this was very good news because the three-step process was one that I had talked about and that I had described in the literature. This is the paper that it came from, which I'm happy to share with you, where we go through the first, second, and third steps, which I'll describe in a little bit more detail here. So plausibility is very simply, from a clinical perspective, does the kind of injury that you're examining actually result in your experience, or based on what you know from the literature or the epidemiologic studies, do these kind of injuries result from these kinds of events, these kinds of crashes? That's pretty easy to do from a clinical perspective because it's just based on experience, but it can also be done from the literature. The second step is, what's the timing? I mean, is there a lot of time between the crash and the injury first being manifest, or is it very close in time? And the last one is, given what we know about the person, we would expect them to have the same injury at the same point in time, but if they hadn't been in the crash. This is called a counterfactual method, or counterfactual causation, because instead of saying, like the insurer says, how did this little tiny crash cause all these injuries? Because most people don't have any injuries. Instead, you're asking the question, if the crash didn't happen, what's the chance this person would have needed to go to the hospital on the same day, or would they'd have developed chronic pain that started on that day? So Etherton allows you to basically just ignore the question of, well, if most people don't get hurt, how did this person get hurt? And instead say, what else caused it? What was the chance we were going to have this if it wasn't the crash? So I'll give you an example of how this would be applied to a low-speed crash injury case. Let's say, I'll just give you a kind of a standard example. Let's say we have a 40-year-old fellow who was involved in a low-speed crash, a rear impact collision, and he's got a history. 3 years ago he had neck problems. Let's say he had an injection in his neck and he got better and he's been okay, but he's maybe a little bit more fragile than the average guy. Immediately he gets neck pain and pain into his right arm. He goes to a chiropractor after he goes to the emergency department, and ultimately he gets referred for an MRI, which shows that he has a disc herniation and he has neck surgery. He ends up with chronic pain, and now he can't work anymore. It's not that unusual of a presentation. So if we're following the Etherton steps, the three-step causation process, the first step would be, can you get this kind of an injury from this kind of a crash? And the answer is yes. That is well established within the literature, and here's some studies that I'm referring to, but also it is consistent with personal experience of clinicians. I think that probably everybody who's listening to this talk would say, yeah, of course people can get disc injuries even from a crash without a lot of damage. We concluded in the paper that's cited as the underlying paper for the Etherton decision that basically any motor vehicle crash, MVC, is a plausible or possible cause of a symptomatic disc injury, regardless of the severity of the crash. Can also point to epidemiologic study that shows that even a 5 mile an hour, 8 kilometer per hour rear impact crash, that chronic injury occurs in about 1 in 29 or 1 in 30, and there are signs of neck disc injuries in about 1 in 40 of the population. And that's based on epidemiologic studies of crashes, looking at what people's medical histories are afterwards. About 1 in 3 people get any degree of injury from the crash. Again, looking at temporal relationship, we talked about that before. If it's very close in time, we tend to think it's causal. At what point do you say this must be a cause? Because we know where we say this can't be a cause. If the man woke up 4 months after the crash, after having no problems, and said, yeah, my neck hurts today, we wouldn't think that the crash was a cause. But the fact that he went to the emergency department right after the crash with neck and arm pain makes us think it's very likely the cause. Alternative causes. So, what can we say about this guy developing ultimately a surgical disc problem at the same time as the crash, but if the crash doesn't happen? Well, I'll just throw out a pretty reliable figure from the United States hospital data, which is that the average 40-year-old man has less than 1 in 2,000 risk of neck surgery in a year. That's pretty accurate. So we're not talking about a year, we're actually talking about a day, and even we're just talking about within an hour or minutes of the crash. But let's just say we're interested in finding out what's the chance that this guy was going to get up on this day and develop pain that leads to neck surgery. We would say it's no more than 1 in 730,000. So how does that work out with the other information we have? Well, we can do an attributable risk calculation. We can say the risk of injury from the crash we know is 1 in 40. The risk of injury at the same time in this guy, in the absence of the crash, is 1 in 730,000. That ratio is about 18,000 to 1 in favor of the crash as the cause. Not even close. And 18,000 to 1 is about 99.99% probability that it's the crash. In other words, it's 17,999 out of 18,000. That's more than 99.99%. Now, let's take this guy's history and say, all right, he was way more likely to develop a surgical problem in a year. Let's accept that as being true. And let's ignore the fact that that would also make him much more likely than the average person to get a neck injury in the crash. Let's say that he was no more likely than everybody else, 1 in 40, to get a disc injury in his neck. And he's 100 times more likely to get a disc injury if the crash doesn't happen. Well, you can see what the math is going to do. Now we just go to 1 in 7,300. So still, that ratio is 180 to 1, more than 180 to 1, in favor of the crash as the cause. That means 179 out of 180 of the causes, or more than 99% probability of cause, is attributable to the crash. So that just gives you an overview of the thinking as to how this sort of an analysis works. And it is evidence-based, and it is repeatable and systematic. Now, I was going to talk to you about a whole bunch of other stuff, including some papers that have just come out. This very neat paper talking about instability that you can see. I talked about video fluoroscopy. This was a 10-year study looking at asymptomatic and symptomatic people and looking at the probability that having instability in the neck would dictate or predict whether or not somebody was injured or not. And it turns out that actually that instability is a very important predictor of injury. It's relatively rarely present when there is no injury. And therefore, if you find, in this particular study, we found that if you find 2 or more findings of instability, just 2 millimeters or more in anterolisthesis, for example, in forward flexion or retrolisthesis and extension, and you find that at 2 areas, that there's almost a 90% chance this person must have been injured by the crash, as opposed to it could just be a normal finding. A couple of papers have to do, one of my PhD students, in fact, Paul Nolet, a very talented scientist, and he is a chiropractic PhD student, and he did this very nice systematic review talking about neck pain after traffic crashes and how much of that neck pain, when it persists after a traffic crash, can be attributed to the crash. He just published the same thing for low back pain. And these are the largest studies and most reliable data that exist now. Last paper was actually one I'm most proud of, because it's a very comprehensive paper talking about the proportion of people who get neck injuries and how many of them go on to develop more significant injuries from traffic crashes. Anyway, this is a big epidemiology paper, and I'm happy to share it with everybody. And of course, I'll share the other 3 papers as well. I don't think I'm going to keep you any longer because of the format that we're in. My hope is that we all we're able to get together next year, and I'll bring some more interesting studies, hopefully, and have more to chat with you about at the time. Okay. I can't take any questions from you, unfortunately, because it's not that kind of format. And if you do have questions, you are welcome to email me, and I think that you'll probably be able to get my email from the ECU folks. So I hope everybody is well and staying healthy, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.